February, mud from heavy rains blanketed Central Korea. Both sides were stuck in the quagmire. The weather stalled the UN advance, but the Chinese were crippled by it. Their supply lines were racked from above by Mother Nature and the American Air Force, and they were dangerously malnourished. As the famous military saying goes, an army marches on its stomach. And with chow always on hand, UN stomachs were satisfied. UN spirits were high, thanks in part to a new 5-day R&R program that gave them a vacation from the front. GIs were shipped off in groups to Japan, where they took full advantage of their mini vacations, treating themselves to great food, lots of sleep, booze, and girls. It was just what the men needed to recharge their batteries for a renewed offensive. Back on the peninsula, USO shows kept the troops smiling and singing between battles. By March 15, 1951, the rejuvenated forces gnawed their way back within striking distance of the 38th parallel, all the way to Seoul's doorstep. They bombarded the city limits with heavy artillery and pried the communists from the city once again. There was no celebration this time. After 4 invasions, Seoul was in shambles. It was business as usual. UN forces pressed on and reached the 38th parallel by the end of March. It had been 6 months since the first invasion of North Korea, and again there was a debate over how far this offensive should go. This time, President Truman wanted a settlement. As he saw it, the first attempt at uniting Korea had proven to be a mistake, and a second attempt would only waste more American lives. MacArthur had a different view. He insisted that the campaign against China be widened to include blockades of its coast and airstrikes on the Chinese mainland. Truman had had enough. He announced to the world that he was firing General MacArthur.
It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
It was a shocking development and sent Truman's popularity into a tailspin. Meanwhile, MacArthur came home to a hero's welcome. He concluded his lifelong quest for immortality with a speech to a joint session of Congress.
Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
With Big Mac gone, the war went on without him. General Ridgway took over the Far East Command, and General James Van Fleet was called in to replace him as field commander. Van Fleet was the consummate soldier. A colonel at Normandy and a staunch anti-communist, he demanded an enormous increase in ammunition so his forces would expend fire and steel, not men. As the UN arsenal expanded, the communist lines contracted. On the map, their retreat looked like a massive withdrawal. But air surveillance reports suggested the Chinese were recoiling for a massive second wave of attacks. When they came, the UN would be ready and waiting. In the spring of 1951, a Chinese buildup was in progress in the Iron Triangle, a mountainous region north of the 38th parallel. UN forces sought to conquer the triangle since it would provide a comfortable buffer zone between the enemy and Seoul. But its borders were heavily guarded and tough to crack. Far East Commander Ridgway knew the Chinese were planning a major drive from the Triangle, so he assumed a conservative offensive strategy in the approaches to it. After facing the Chinese for 6 months, his troops knew how they operated. They would come hard, and then suddenly not at all. They were vicious fighters, but only in spurts. So Ridgway drew a series of lines leading up to the Iron Triangle that would mark the stages of his planned advance. When the troops reached one line, they would use it as a jumping-off point to push on for the next. If they had to fall back, the previous line would be a place to stop and shore up defenses so that the retreat wouldn't pick up speed. Each line was named for an American state. The 8th Army had recently conquered the Idaho Line and was now standing along the Kansas Line a few miles above the 38th parallel. The next goal would be the Utah Line, an extension of the Kansas. Finally, the Wyoming Line lay at the base of the Iron Triangle. Whether going or coming along that grid, the UN goal was to butcher the enemy in massive numbers. By late April, UN forces were holding the Utah Line and pushing hard to reach Wyoming. Then the second Chinese wave suddenly broke. On April 22nd, heavy attacks came against the weaker South Korean units in the center of the peninsula. The Reds again threatened to split the UN front in two, but the new phased line retreat strategy worked. The 8th Army fell back to the Kansas line and dug in deep. There they held hard and took everything the Chinese could offer. Within a week, the enemy ran low on supplies and men and suffered huge losses for an insignificant piece of land. To the American troops who had seen their adversaries run out of gas after all of their previous attacks, this was no surprise. The communists were getting predictable. 2 weeks later, the Chinese tried one last major offensive, but this time, Field Commander Van Fleet had a special treat for them. He ordered an unprecedented barrage of heavy artillery. In a single 24-hour period, one battalion fired off more than 12,000 rounds, an all-time record. Teams of troops operated an assembly line of ammunition, sending an endless succession of shells airborne. 35,000 Chinese were killed or wounded, at a cost of only 900 UN servicemen. The bombardment is remembered today as the Van Fleet Load. The general's aim to expend steel, not men, had come to fruition. UN firepower was beating Red manpower. In June, Van Fleet's forces made it to the Wyoming line. Their advance was moving so fast that they overran active communist bases and took thousands of prisoners and supplies as they went. But when they tried to break into the Iron Triangle itself, they collided with a steel wall of enemy resistance. It took 10 days of round-the-clock air support and artillery attacks to break into the Triangle's base. But once they cracked the foundation, the whole house collapsed. 2 tank forces drove northward and took full control of the Triangle, putting the UN in their best position since the Chinese entered the war. It was an ideal field position to bring to the truce table. Total victory over the Chinese might take years and cost countless American lives. So Ridgway wired Washington to say the time to talk peace was now. President Truman and his Joint Chiefs concurred. It was time to extend the olive branch. At the end of June 1951, the United Nations offered to talk peace with North Korea. 2 days later, the Communists replied in kind. It was encouraging news. For the talks, the truce team settled on the tiny village of Panmunjom, between enemy lines. Right away, it was obvious that the negotiations would be as torturous as the war itself. Both sides came to the table acting as the victor, pressing the other to make concessions expected of the loser. Their objectives differed drastically. The UN wanted a new border drawn along current front lines. The Communists called for a return to the 38th parallel. The Chinese demanded that all their prisoners be returned, even against their will. But the Reds had slaughtered most of the UN captives they had taken. Of the more than 100,000 UN soldiers thought captured by the Reds, only about 13,000 came back. Relieved just to be alive, those lucky few told horrifying tales of torture, brainwashing, and severe hunger. They talked about the Chinese campaign to re-educate them and turn them against the cause of democracy. They were forced at gunpoint to speak out against America on the radio. And they described prison camps where there was no medicine and rampant disease. Thousands went crazy. Thousands more starved to death. Across the front line, UN prisons were safer and better organized. The most threatening enemy within these camps were not the guards, but other prisoners. Chinese inmates split into pro- and anti-communist factions. Often their animosity toward each other turned deadly, and the communists back at the peace table used the discord in these camps as propaganda against the United Nations. The talks continually broke down. Neither side would budge on anything, and when progress stalled at Panmunjom, tensions heightened on the front lines. Heavy displays of force were a way of reinforcing diplomatic sincerity. The last 2 years of the war were a series of highly charged skirmishes fueled by impatience, frustration, and resentment. But between the periods of intense fighting, there were countless idle hours of waiting. Troops on both sides passed the time by reinforcing their positions. Barracks were built and foxholes dug all over Central Korea. The dirt from the foxholes filled the sandbags that were stacked to build bunkers. And from these bunkers high in the hills, troops kept watch on the enemy, who was spying back on them from across the valley. While playing the waiting game, troops took photos of Korean vistas to take home with them. When they weren't building better bunkers or snapping photos, troops would write letters home or attend religious services, praying for their lost buddies, but never for themselves.
You pray for your friends that they might be spared. For yourself, you pray that if you're killed, it'll be quick and merciful. You never prayed, "Spare me, God, and I'll be good." It would sound selfish if you prayed that you wanted to be spared. Doug Koch, Private First Class.
In these hills, if there was one selfish wish worth praying for, it was to always hold the high ground. And in the summer of 1952, the 8th Army had their sights set on the hills ahead of them. If they could just advance to the next ridge, that would be enough.